The CIA carried out its first major overseas regime change in Iran in 1953. It was called Operation Ajax, a joint effort with British intelligence to target Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. He was a popular, democratically elected leader who had cut off British access to Iranian oil by nationalizing the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. For the U.S., the concern was more than just the oil. They feared that Mossadegh's move might open the door to Soviet influence during the Cold War. The CIA funded street protests, spread anti-Mossadegh propaganda through local media, and paid off Iranian politicians, military officers, and religious leaders. After an initial failed attempt, the second push succeeded in August 1953, when royalist forces arrested Mossadegh and restored Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to full power. The Shah would rule for the next 26 years with U.S. support. In 1970, Chile held a free and fair election. The winner? Salvador Allende, a doctor and Marxist senator. His victory was the first time in history that a socialist leader gained power not through revolution, but through the ballot box. For many in Chile, it was a triumph of democracy, but for Washington, it was a threat. The Nixon administration ordered the CIA to prevent Salvador Allende from taking office, and if that didn't work, to destabilize his government. Under Project Fubelt, the CIA funded opposition political parties, supported nationwide strikes, and placed stories in the media aimed at discrediting Allende. These actions, carried out between 1970 and 1973, were designed to erode his political support and strengthen opposition forces ahead of the next election, or a possible military takeover. On September 11, 1973, Chile's military, led by General Augusto Pinochet, stormed the presidential palace. Allende did not survive the day, reportedly taking his own life. Allende's presidency had lasted just 3 years. Pinochet's dictatorship lasted 17. The U.S. officially denied involvement in the coup itself, but documents later revealed just how deeply it had worked to set things up. President Jacobo Arbenz seized unused farmland from large estates in Guatemala and redistributed it to poor farmers in 1952. One major target was the United Fruit Company, a U.S. corporation with close ties to the Eisenhower administration. Arbenz offered compensation for the property based on tax records, but that was far below market value. In response, the CIA launched Operation PB Success. A small paramilitary force led by Carlos Castillo Armas was trained and armed in Honduras. At the same time, the agency executed a broad psychological campaign. Fake radio reports announced rebel victories, aircraft dropped propaganda leaflets, and minor bombings were staged to create the impression of a large advancing army. The real tipping point came when Guatemala's own military leadership lost confidence in Arbenz, believing a U.S.-backed invasion was inevitable and unstoppable. Facing mounting pressure, Arbenz resigned on June 27, 1954. Castillo Armas took power days later. The coup ended Guatemala's democracy and set off decades of military rule and civil war. By the end of 1966, more than 500,000 Indonesians had lost their lives, most of them accused of communist sympathies. It started with a political crisis on October 1, 1965, when a group of junior military officers, in an event known as Gestapo, attempted a coup and took out 6 generals. The army, under General Suharto, blamed the powerful Communist Party. What followed was a purge unlike anything Southeast Asia had seen before. U.S. officials supported Suharto's rise. According to declassified memos and first-hand testimony, the CIA likely provided lists of suspected communists to the Indonesian military. American diplomats described the mass detentions and casualties as a cleansing. Within a year, the standing president, President Sukarno, had been sidelined, and Suharto took control, ushering in decades of pro-Western military rule. In late 2013, Ukraine became the center of a geopolitical tug-of-war between Russia and the West. President Viktor Yanukovych had been negotiating a trade agreement with the European Union, but suddenly reversed course and aligned with Russia instead. The decision sparked massive protests in Kyiv, known as the Euromaidan movement, and by February 2014, it turned violent. Yanukovych fled to Russia, and a new Western-leaning government took his place. Though the uprising was driven by Ukrainians, U.S. involvement behind the scenes raised eyebrows. A leaked phone call between U.S. diplomat Victoria Nuland and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine revealed that American officials were actively discussing who should join the new leadership. This, along with long-standing CIA presence in the region, fueled allegations of covert orchestration. There's no confirmed CIA-led coup here, but the level of U.S. influence and coordination during the transition has led many to view it as a modern case of regime engineering. In January 1961, Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister of newly independent Congo, was executed by political rivals. His body was never found. At the time, the U.S. government denied involvement. Years later, declassified documents told a different story. When Congo gained independence from Belgium in 1960, it quickly fell into chaos. Lumumba turned to the Soviet Union for help, partly because the U.S. had refused. That single move set off alarm bells in Washington. CIA Director Alan Dulles labeled Lumumba a potential African Fidel Castro. Declassified documents confirm the CIA not only planned to remove Lumumba from power, but actively pursued his elimination. Director Alan Dulles authorized covert operations, including a poison plot. And while the CIA didn't directly take him out, it supported a political climate leading to his ultimate demise. The Kennedy and Johnson administrations feared President João Goulart's policies were turning Brazil into a new communist state in South America. On March 31, 1964, Brazil's armed forces moved to remove Goulart. He fled to Uruguay. A military junta took power and quickly received recognition and diplomatic backing from the United States. The CIA had been closely monitoring the political climate. Declassified records show the U.S. provided funding to opposition politicians, maintained contact with military leaders planning the overthrow, and readied naval forces offshore just in case U.S. military support was needed. Over the next 2 decades, Brazil remained under military rule. On November 1, 1963, South Vietnamese generals launched a coup. The CIA had prior knowledge and offered no resistance. President Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu tried to flee but were captured and executed the next day. U.S. officials expressed shock at their passings, but records show they were aware of the risk. CIA officers in Saigon reported growing discontent with South Vietnam's military generals. Back in August, the U.S. sent mixed signals, publicly supporting Diem, but privately encouraging a change in leadership if it meant a more stable and anti-communist government. The coup failed to stabilize South Vietnam. Over the next 2 years, leadership turnover and internal conflict worsened. In 1965, the U.S. deployed combat troops to the country. In February 1963, a military coup in Iraq toppled Prime Minister Abd al-Karim Qasim, a nationalist leader who had distanced Iraq from the West and rejected both Soviet and American dominance. The group that took power was the Ba'ath Party, which would later become synonymous with Saddam Hussein, a young party member at the time. Within days, mass arrests began, and many suspected communists and leftists were executed. Here's where the CIA comes in. Multiple credible sources, including former U.S. officials, have claimed the agency provided lists of suspected communists to the new regime. Declassified British and U.S. documents show both governments were in close contact with the coup plotters in advance. While there's no smoking gun proving CIA operational control, circumstantial evidence is strong. The U.S. quickly recognized the new government and restored military and economic aid. In early 1949, the Syrian parliament blocked U.S. approval for the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, a major infrastructure project backed by American and Saudi oil interests. Around the same time, Colonel Hosni al-Zaim, a Syrian army chief of staff, began holding private meetings with CIA officers in Damascus. Internal CIA documents and later congressional investigations confirm that these contacts occurred in the lead-up to a military coup. On March 30, 1949, Zaim seized power, dissolving the legislature and arresting dozens of political opponents. Within days, he approved the previously rejected pipeline project. The United States quickly recognized his new government. Beyond encouraging the takeover and offering diplomatic assurances, the CIA coordinated with Hosni al-Zaim, providing financial support and strategic advice to ensure the coup's success, though it did not supply weapons or troops. This was the first documented case of CIA support for a foreign regime change, and marked the beginning of a broader U.S. strategy in the Middle East during the Cold War. On April 11, 2002, Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez was removed from office by military leaders after days of mass protests and violent clashes. A business executive, Pedro Carmona, briefly took power. Chavez returned 2 days later after loyalist forces and supporters reversed the coup. The U.S. publicly denied involvement, but records show that American officials had met with opposition leaders before the event. A 2002 State Department memo acknowledged that the U.S. knew of plans for a possible coup and did not warn Chavez. The CIA's role remains unproven, but the agency had been active in Venezuela for years, and Congress-funded groups had supported opposition parties. Though the coup failed, it had long-term effects. Chavez used it to consolidate power, deepen anti-U.S. rhetoric, and frame his movement as under siege. Washington's rapid initial support for the interim regime led many to view the U.S. as complicit, even in the absence of confirmed CIA direction. Cambodia's leader, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, had spent years trying to keep his country neutral during the Vietnam War. That neutrality broke down when he tolerated North Vietnamese troops operating in eastern Cambodia, something the U.S. saw as a direct threat to its war effort. While Sihanouk was out of the country in 1970, his prime minister, Lon Nol, led a vote in parliament to remove him. The United States quickly endorsed the new government and increased military support. Though no declassified records directly links the CIA to planning the takeover, U.S. officials had been cultivating ties with anti-Sihanouk figures, and military aid surged immediately after the change. Lon Nol's regime aligned with the U.S., but proved weak and corrupt. In 1967, a group of mid-level officers, later known as the Colonel's Junta, launched a preemptive coup to block upcoming elections they feared would empower left-leaning parties. The CIA had been monitoring the conspirators for months. Though U.S. officials preferred a more moderate alternative, they made no effort to prevent the takeover. Once in power, the junta arrested thousands of political opponents and suspended civil liberties. The United States quickly recognized the new regime and continued to provide military and economic aid, despite mounting reports of harsh treatment and repression. Though the full extent of CIA involvement is still classified, Congressional inquiries later confirmed close contact between U.S. personnel and coup leaders before and after the takeover. The junta remained in power until 1974, when internal divisions and a failed operation in Cyprus led to its collapse. When President Juan José Torres invited labor unions and leftist organizers into Bolivia's policymaking process, U.S. officials grew concerned. Torres had also allowed Soviet and Cuban advisors into the country and criticized U.S. influence in Latin America. These actions positioned him as a Cold War threat. On August 21, 1971, General Hugo Banzer seized power in a military coup. CIA files declassified in later years confirmed that the U.S. had prior contact with Banzer and provided military support for his bid to remove Torres. After taking control, Banzer banned leftist parties, arrested political opponents, and aligned Bolivia more closely with U.S. and Brazilian interests. He remained in power until 1978 and returned again through elections in the 1990s. Torres fled the country, but was later assassinated in Argentina under Operation Condor, a regional intelligence network supported by multiple U.S.-backed regimes. The coup marked a shift in Bolivia's Cold War alignment. Rafael Trujillo ruled the Dominican Republic with absolute power for over 30 years. His regime combined rigid control with personal enrichment and a cult of personality. Political opponents disappeared, press freedom didn't exist, and foreign criticism was met with violence, including an attempt to 86 Venezuela's president in 1960. At that point, Trujillo had become a liability, even to the United States, which had supported him for decades as an anti-communist strongman. His erratic behavior and growing hostility toward U.S. allies pushed Washington to reconsider. The CIA began contacting Dominican dissidents and supplying them with weapons, including pistols and M1 carbines. Declassified records and Senate investigations confirm the agency was aware of and materially supported the plot to take out Trujillo. On May 30, 1961, the dictator was ambushed and shot while traveling in his car. He did not survive. The Trujillo era was over, and the transition that followed was unstable. U.S. troops intervened in 1965 during a civil conflict, aiming to prevent a leftist government from gaining power. Gamal Abdel Nasser was a 34-year-old army officer when he helped lead the Free Officers Movement in Egypt. In July 1952, they overthrew King Farouk I, ending more than a century of monarchy and colonial-era influence. The coup was swift and nearly bloodless. The role of the United States and the CIA in this transition remains disputed. One of the CIA's top operatives in that region, Miles Copeland, later claimed he had direct contact with Nasser and other officials in the months leading up to the coup. He described offering encouragement and informal political advice. However, no declassified U.S. document confirms operational support, and historians remain divided over whether the agency played an active role or simply maintained diplomatic ties. What is known is that the U.S. quickly recognized the new regime. In the early years, relations between Nasser and Washington were relatively warm, before deteriorating during the Suez Crisis in 1956. If the CIA was involved, it did so without the full apparatus of covert action seen in later coups. Within 8 months of taking office, Jean-Bertrand Aristide was gone, forced from power by a military coup in September 1991. His removal marked the collapse of Haiti's first democratically elected government after decades of dictatorship. The coup was led by Army Chief Raoul Cedras, who accused Aristide of inciting political violence. The United States publicly condemned the takeover. However, questions soon emerged about whether the CIA had deeper connections. Reports from the time indicated that Cedras and other coup leaders were longtime CIA assets, receiving payments and intelligence support during the Cold War. Though there's no direct evidence the U.S. ordered the coup, Washington's response was slow. Economic sanctions were imposed, but no immediate effort was made to restore Aristide. In 1994, under mounting international pressure, the U.S. sent troops to reinstall him. Fast forward to February 29, 2004, where official accounts state that Jean-Bertrand Aristide resigned voluntarily among rising unrest. Armed groups had taken over cities, opposition protests had escalated, and his government appeared to be losing control. U.S. officials said they helped him flee for his safety. But Aristide told a different story. Speaking from exile, he claimed he had been forcibly removed by U.S. personnel and taken out of the country against his will. Independent investigations later revealed that U.S. diplomats had pressured Aristide to step down, and the plane which flew him to the Central African Republic was arranged by Washington. While there's no clear, undeniable proof of CIA involvement, the timing raised suspicion. U.S.-funded organizations had supported anti-Aristide groups in the years leading up to the crisis, and the Bush administration refused to send help to protect the government, despite Haiti's request. On November 11, 1975, Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam was dismissed by the Governor-General in a constitutional crisis that stunned the country. The official reason involved a budget standoff, but political pressure had been mounting from other fronts, including foreign intelligence concerns. Whitlam had threatened to close U.S. intelligence bases in Australia and publicly questioned the activities of the CIA. Just weeks before his dismissal, he accused the agency of interfering in Australian politics. While the CIA has denied involvement, former agents, including Victor Marchetti, later claimed the agency had been alarmed by Whitlam's positions and took steps to undermine him. Australia's official inquiry concluded that the dismissal was legal. But to this day, some historians argue that foreign pressure may have played a quiet but decisive role. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe learned something. If you did enjoy it, please give us a like. It really helps the channel. And check out another video from our channel that's on your screen right now. And if you have something to say, please leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again. See you next time.